we'll be talking about conservation districts and the association. Some of them we've met, or maybe all of you we've met before, last year. I know, yeah, I think we had at least one opportunity to get some testimony. So we won't, unless you feel it's necessary, introduce ourselves. But if, when you come on up, if you want to just remind us of who you are, what your role is, that would be terrific. So I think that Sarah is going to be first.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm Sarah Damsel. I work for the Orleans County Conservation District as the district manager, and my office is in Newport, and I live in Glover. So we're gonna share with you today just an overview of who we are and an overview of our work. Our work is accomplished through extensive local, state, and federal partnerships through a pretty significant network of those partners. We're funded through a variety of sources, and we have been boots on the ground for years. And in the past few years, we've been working in a more capacity here at the State House on advocating for our work. With the passage of the Vermont Clean Water Initiative and many other conservation and agriculture related efforts in the state, our work has increased. We have been building capacity and we are building capacity, but this demand of all of the efforts in the state of conservation level and the agricultural level really strains our organizations. So we're here to ask you to consider adding our appropriations request to your memo to the Appropriations Committee. Next slide. So for those who don't know the conservation district, so it sounds like you all remember our testimony from previous years, but there are 14 conservation districts in the state of Vermont. Some of them are county territories, some of them are watershed territories. There are conservation districts across the entire country. There's a total of 3,000 conservation districts. So the 14 districts in this state function within a bigger system across the country. Next slide. The conservation districts exist by state statute. The State Natural Resources Conservation Council is kind of our umbrella agency, and that's where state or legislative appropriations go to that agency and are distributed to the 14 conservation districts. This really busy diagram is just to really give you a visual on sort of the conservation delivery system. And we just want to make the point that we are at the center of that delivery system. We're sort of the hub and the glue with all of the different partners that we work with, really to all work together to serve the landowners' conservation goals, as well as work with municipalities and both really to reach sort of our collective goal around kind of the public good of the conservation work that we all do.
Can you just, I'm having a little trouble reading that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it up in front of me. Can you just read like who some of those other block names in those blocks are?
Yes. So at the top is the state of Vermont. So that's where I was saying where our appropriations come out of you all at the top, and then it goes down to the Agency of Agriculture, and then it goes down to council, who I was saying is our umbrella organization who exists by state statute. And then those dollars get distributed to the 14 conservation districts. And beyond funding, there often is more of also just a working relationship in terms of, priorities in getting work done and working with producers. And then there's the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts over to the left. And so all of the 14 conservation districts are members of the association. The association works on our behalf with advocacy and then also sourcing funds and holding block grants and developing relationships, things like that, providing trainings for all of us. And then over to the right is USDA NRCS, and I can explain a little bit more in a few slides about our relationship with NRCS. And then at the bottom, which, all of us are really serving the goal of supporting landowners and producers. Does that help?
Yes, it does, actually.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. Oh, okay. Sorry, this one's a little bit different. So this slide, I just wanted to share a little bit about the structure of conservation districts in that, we exist by state statute. And the structure of our businesses are really more like municipalities versus a nonprofit. So we don't have 501c3 status. We really function more like a municipality. We have a 5-member board, which goes through an election process, which is laid out in our statute. Each conservation district, we are our own business entities, and each of all of the staff work for that business entity of that local conservation district. Next slide. I think that's my 4th slide, right? Go. All right. Yeah. Oh, is this yes, sorry, this is mine. This is NRCS. Sorry. Oh, no, you can go back to the last one, I guess. Yes, sorry. So this is earlier in that diagram where NRCS was over to the right. So conservation districts and NRCS were created out of response to the Dust Bowl. So we really share our historical roots together with NRCS. We all share, most conservation districts sit in an NRCS office. We work really closely with them to understand the needs of the community and prioritize technical and financial assistance through those federal dollars. So we have active working relationships, and we have very historical tied roots to NRCS. Okay, I think the next slide is.
Before you go to the next slide, I
Yeah.
actually can read, for whatever reason, this slide. And that, the information in the paragraph at the bottom, I think might be helpful just to highlight.
While the Vermont's Natural Resource Conservation Districts are critical state partners for NRCS, the federal government does not contribute meaningfully toward the operational expense outside of the shared office space and technology. So that is true in that we do share that office space, and that exists because each conservation district has an unfunded cooperative agreement with the USDA NRCS to have that space and to have that computer. There's also deliverables that are tied to that. So we work with them, like I said, to prioritize the local needs, to help landowners get access to their federal resources. And so sometimes that looks like outreach and education, providing community workshops and those types of communications work. So in that unfunded cooperative agreement, there are deliverables associated to us being there.
Not unique to Vermont and true of this conservation districts here.
No, there was a template unfunded cooperative agreement that was distributed across the country, and then it was tailored a little bit to Vermont, if I remember correctly, that's how that happened. Yeah, and that has been in place for a long time.
Representative O'Brien.
Do you get any funding from NRCS or the opposite? Are you a fiscal agent for NRCS granting to, say, a farmer where they need a fiscal agent?
So we're not a fiscal agent for them. I don't know of any examples of that currently existing, mostly because they don't really have gaps in their system for that. They have a lot of financial, systems to get that financial dollars out the door. There are some conservation districts that do have active grants with Conservation District. I am one of them. And then the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts receives quite a bit of funding from NRCS to provide technical assistance. And some of that funding does go to individual conservation districts. Right. Yeah.
So basically, we provide the technical assistance that enables the farmers to get the grants. And we may help with all levels of paperwork, both the conservation planning and the paperwork, but we don't actually manage NRCS money coming through us.
Yeah, and then the other piece that's really tied into our statute and into directives from NRCS is that conservation districts, not specific to Vermont, but around the country, lead what we call the locally led process, where the conservation districts are sort of the seat at the head of the table with all of the existing entities in our local region, plus landowners, to look at what are those conservation needs, like I was trying to say earlier, so that we can prioritize those federal dollars around technical assistance and financial assistance so that, in the Memphremagog watershed, our natural resource concerns might look a little bit different than Poultney Meadowies. And we're really sending that, information up to the feds. And historically, the way the NRCS worked is they have ranking questions, if you all know this lingo. So there's federal ranking questions, state ranking questions, and local ranking questions, and that's how projects were compared against each other so that they could get pre-obligated and pre-approved for those federal dollars. The conservation districts always set those local 5 questions, and so we really had a place at the table to drive those federal dollars. They've changed that system a little bit. It's a little bit more kind of like background data set based. And so now it's based on threshold, based on a lot of geodata and where that particular project is located with all of these geodata layers. I won't bore you too much, sorry. But so now our relationships looks a little bit different because they've changed the way ranking has happened, but we still work with them on what those thresholds are. And we still provide them feedback on what we see as needs for those federal dollars. And then recently, the head of NRCS Vermont has provided an opportunity for conservation districts to put proposals forward for the use of federal dollars in a specific county, which we call local fund pools. So the Orleans Conservation District can have one bucket of money for the Orleans County, for the Orleans County residents based on the feedback that the Conservation District provides. Whereas now, if somebody in my county applies for a project, they're basically competing with somebody from Hillary's county. So it creates a very specialized bucket of money that the conservation districts really have a strong hand in making that happen.
Jill, could I just ask you to introduce yourself for the record since you're
Absolutely,
not
Jill.
on camera?
Jill Arachi, Executive Director of the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts. I'm here just to help with questions about the big picture.
Okay, so I do think the next slide is Hillary's.
Hi, Hillary Solomon, Pulteney Meadow Natural Resources Conservation District, and again from Middletown Springs, and the office is in Pulteney. Yes, we're presenting the same slides, but in a slightly different order, so excuse us if we occasionally have to check. So we're submitting again our request this year for a $3 million appropriation. This would be for our base funding to help support our organization as a whole and our administrative efforts, and our increased capacity and our increased ability to leverage other funds and support more projects on the ground. And if we go into our appropriation history, we originally had $112,000 from the legislature for many, many, many years. And that would be split between the 14 districts and then also any shared staff that we had. Usually there was a shared staff person who would help us with some oversight. So we started requesting increased legislative allocations a couple of years ago, and the legislature gave us a $250,000 increase and then added another $250,000 last year. So at our peak last year in the budget, we had $612,000, which was great. And we actually doubled the amount of funding that we leveraged through grant requests, and we increased our staffing significantly. This year in the budget that was just released, we found out that the governor had subtracted out that original $112,000. So they funded us at $500,000 for this year. I think the next slide, please. Okay. So again, the type of funding that we would be looking for is funding to cover sort of our administrative and our operational costs. As we increase our number of staff, just the time it takes to run payroll, keep your books, the amount of the insurance cost, all of these things sort of increase proportionally to the volume of staff that we have. Okay, sorry, just double checking. And that's where we've had with the lack of base funding for many, many, many years, we're basically backfilling this need. And so we're trying to catch up to where we should be, today, and grow into the capacity that what might have had if we had better funding in the past. And so we do have a lot of grants. Most of our funding has been through annual grants. The Poultney Meadowy Conservation District right now has 37 active grants. Those range from 1 to 3-year grants, depending on the source of funding. And they all have requirements. Some have quarterly reporting requirements. The invoicing is very detailed. The reporting is quite detailed. And every year it gets more and more. There's more and more information required through each of these reports or invoicing mechanisms as things get sort of tightened up at the state level or federal level. So the difference then between this sort of base funding and grant funding is that every grant has a set of requirements. It also has project work, which is great. We love doing projects, but it's a prescribed work that you have told a funder that you will do. And so the problem happens when somebody calls with a technical assistance request and it doesn't really align with the type of work that you're doing. I got a call from a horse farm in Benson, and they were having a problem with an invasive weed growing in their horse pasture because of all the increased rain over the last couple of years. So their horse pasture was sort of leaning more toward wetland than horse pasture. And I don't have funds to do invasive species work outside of our local lakes. I do have funds to do invasive species work in our local lakes, but not in a horse pasture. So it just, you're sort of left with these people who call for assistance. And of course you provide them that assistance, but that's the type of work that would come out of some kind of base funding if it didn't align properly with the grant that you had.
Representative O'Brien has a question, I think.
Can you give us an idea of where that money's coming from? If you have 37 grants, is it,
Okay.
yes, or is it not for profits like Merck or,
Yeah, so it's okay, so we have a pretty even split between state and federal dollars. And then we have private dollars also, a little bit less of the private dollars. And the state, so it's the ANR and Agency of Ag for the state. And then we have, for federal dollars, we work with Lake Champlain Sea Grant, we work with the US Forest Service, we work with US Fish and Wildlife. We have in the past worked with NRCS on sort of direct granting programs. We're not doing that right now. We do work with NRCS through the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts on a couple of different things. And then the state dollars are for tactical basin planning. I am one of the CWISPs, the Clean Water Service Provider, so I get funding through that. And then like designing and implementing stormwater projects, which will probably transition from the state block grants, which where they are right now, into the formula grant through the CWISPs. And the private dollars are kind of exciting. We have some High Meadows funds, which is with Vermont Community Foundation now, and then some Pure Projet dollars, which is an overseas nonprofit that Pure Projet, they're from France. So they get donations from hotels when their customers like hang up their towels and don't have all their towels washed every day. They donate funds into a tree planting campaign. So we are part of their North American project. And we use that funding to augment state funding because that funding pays for a couple of years of maintenance on those sites. So we can go back to those tree planting sites and replant the trees that get eaten by rodents and deer and make sure that they get a better start. So we're able to use those funds together to create a better project.
Is that specifically your conservation district that has that?
We do have a direct relationship with them. We were their first conservation district that they worked with, but that has spread to a statewide program now.
Representative Cole.
I'm curious about your relationship with VHCB, and VHCB obviously has very different day-to-day tasks than you do. But you both have, the conservation in your name. And I'm curious if I know that the governor's budget cuts into VHCB a lot this year as well. And I know, part of that is a result of federal funding going away. But I'm curious about how, working together or not working together, how this has been playing out for you and how maybe we could be more collaborative as, those two entities and use the funding allocated for each to maximize the limited funds that we have toward conservation projects, even though I know their focus is on housing as well, but we did, give them that name to have conservation too. So, yeah, and as a legislature, how we can support you in the two groups because we are funneling
Right.
funding both the same, or those entities, you know, how we can do a better job of making sure that you're talking to each other and working together.
Right. Yeah, that would be great. And, you know, I work with them in different capacities. So
Yeah.
we take advantage of their grant programs for farms and we help farms. Their applications are pretty complex and we help
Yeah.
farms fill those out, write letters of support for them. So they're also the clean water service provider for Lake Memphremagog. So we work together, you know, in that capacity too, as, you know, clean water service providers who are working as as the guidance and the sort of protocols for the clean water service providers are currently being developed.
So that seems like, you know, one example, like you just said, like their applications are pretty complex and it's back onto you to help navigate those applications for farmers. Which is a beautiful service that I think is kind of underrated that you all provide. But maybe is there a way that we can sort of help get not in between necessarily, but, you know, support. So because you have, you know, minimal resources, how can we make that connection easier? Like, would we give input on the grant application process, or like what is required of the granting to VHEB? Or I don't know if this is even germane to this topic, but it's just trying to maximize limited resources.
Yeah, and I feel like they're better funded than we are. And
Exactly. Yeah.
yes, it would be nice to be considered as well, and maybe have more discussions with them, sort of like higher level discussions with them about how we might work together. And that's something that is a great idea, and we should set that up. Yeah.
If I could add just a little bit to that. So another way that we work together is most of VHCB's easements, you know, are half funded by the state and half funded by NRCS.
Mhm.
And sometimes we're behind that NRCS work, right? We're assisting NRCS with preparing the easement, you know, the farmland easement or forestry easement. And so we're just kind of visible because we're doing the technical assistance part of it. And then districts may be involved in a particular property where there's an easement, a land trust easement, and assisting the land trust, the Vermont Land Trust often is a major partner for the HCB in developing that easement and then helping the farmer fulfill easement requirements. So there may be, for example, some requirements of easement that there'll be a 50-foot buffer, riparian buffer. The district will plant trees. So there actually is collaboration.
Yeah.
But it's not institutional. And I just will say, as it's related to the funding question, I think it's historical. I've asked Gus, like, how come we weren't involved in this? Again, it has to do with the historical, how VHB was created. In other states, a lot of districts are actually funded the way that VHB is funded.
Interesting. So yeah, and just based on that response, it seems that VHCB couldn't necessarily, this is, you know, a big statement, lofty, I guess. But it seems that VHCB couldn't carry that C unless you were in the picture, like carry through with, because you are, I mean, I think they do fantastic work, but it seems like you are part of that on the ground work, like creating that buffer that you manage. Like that's not necessarily VHCB employees who are actually on the ground doing that, or even, so, yeah, so that is definitely something to consider. And the fact that other states are doing that model as well. I don't know if it could be a better way to
Certainly
consolidate.
share other state data with you and pull that together for you. It's sort of just for your
Interesting
curiosity.
Yeah.
Meg, what's our next slide? Not sure if I'm passing it off right now. And we had been hoping that we would mostly have a discussion in here. So we do all have examples of projects that we've done, and we're happy to share those examples with you. I think I already talked about this one, right?
You did.
I did, okay. Yeah. And this is really just, you know, looking at our statute. And I don't know if you were planning to present this slide, but okay. So I guess the question is, do you guys want like a project example before I hop up? Okay. So the one, okay. So I'm trying to think of which one. I have three I could.
So you're thinking of a project that you did that we had to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what I'm going to go with, we did a watershed-wide flood resilience project in the Flower Brook watershed. So we worked with the 3 towns, Tinmouth, Danby, and Pollitt. Pollitt received really, really heavy flooding in Irene. Thankfully, not quite as badly in the more recent flood events. And so we worked with those towns to look across the town boundaries to the watershed itself and try to figure out the ways that we could sort of mitigate this flood damage that was happening downstream and the ways that we could absorb more water on the landscape. So we had really high quality forest blocks in the headwaters, but a lot of them were split. They were spaghetti lots with many different landowners. So we worked with those landowners as a group, brought them together. We had workshops with Forest Parks and Rec and support staff from NRCS, actually, their forestry group, and talked about the different programs available and ways to sort of visualize their property as part of this larger forest block instead of as individual properties. And then we identified a number of stormwater projects down in the town of Paulet. We went around door to door and introduced those project ideas to the residents and like individually got buy-in for the different projects, ranked them and implemented a number of those projects through multiple grants. And then we also worked with farms in the area and we implemented some exclusion fencing projects, some tree planting projects, and really tried to buffer those streams so that they were not receiving the volumes of floodwaters during the rain events that had caused so much damage in Paulet. So that's just an example of how we work with a variety of different landowner types, towns, individual landowners in a variety of different sectors to do this type of work that would help this entire watershed try to minimize damage, sort of where it all comes together in a town that's located right on the banks of a creek.
Hillary, it sounds really like the kind of thing we might want to have a longer conversation about, what you just described. Just in terms of the grant funding amount, how much money were we?
So we received some funds from the High Meadow Fund for this initially, and this was post-Irene, looking at the damage that had happened during Irene. So they really wanted to start looking at flooding in towns, not as a town issue, but as a watershed-wide issue. So we got some seed money from them, which was great because that's what allowed us to do the outreach and the grant writing to support the rest of it. So in a way, that was our base funding for this project. And then we wrote grants to do the tree planting. We wrote grants to do culvert replacements. We wrote grants for the exclusion fencing. And we wrote a grant to do a study. It was basically a landscape analysis, which is how we looked at the forest blocks. And then we tried to figure out which areas in the headwaters were contributing the most sediment into the stream, which was actually clogging. The stream was getting clogged in Paulet, and so it was filling up, and the water was then being forced out into people's yards. So we had a study from LCBP to look at that. And then I'm forgetting. Oh, and then we also got some funds from LCBP to do Lake Champlain Basin Program to do some remediation work in the forestry, the actual forest roads on these properties. And we got a grant. So there are a lot of these long skinny lots have long skinny driveways, and most of them cross Flower Brook. So we actually got a grant from Lake Champlain Basin Program also to do work on 2 of those driveways. And we pulled in 2 different consultants so they could kind of work together because it's very rare that you get funding to work on private driveways. And we pulled in 2 different like excavator operators so that they could learn these skills. And we put in these like mini dry wells and we did some really interesting practices. And they did make it through the June flood events. So that was exciting.
Sounds like it was over the course of years even.
Yeah, this was 2016 through, it's continuing. We just found out we got funds from High Meadows has a new name now, but we just got some funds to continue this work. Because it takes this sort of, we're still building, we still have some, like as we develop projects and identify projects, there are just more and more and more. But yeah, it seems like it's gone well. The Flower Brook, I can't claim credit for this, but the flooding wasn't as bad in Paulet recently, and I'm hopeful that we at least contributed a little bit to that result.
So do you coordinate with the regional planning commissions then on like their hydrology sort of inventories on culverts and things, and also do towns, you sort of have matching funds for towns, so sort of incent them to say like, yeah, this culvert's a big problem here, if we had some matching money, we would replace it.
Right. So basically we went through the culverts, all the culvert data that you're talking about that the regional planning commissions collect. And we prioritize the ones for both the compatibility with the stream in terms of the geomorphology and also fish passage, because that's another place where we could help get funds. We could replace a culvert for fish passage, but then it deals with the flood resilience also. So we did go through, we approached all the towns. We had maps of all the culverts we thought would be the highest priority to replace. In Pollitt, they had very actively been replacing culverts. So that was a town that had less of a need. In Danby, that wasn't the case, and we are working with them on a redesign of a culvert that's on Purchase Brook, which is a tributary. Yeah, and then Tinmouth didn't have culverts because it was too far up into the headwaters. But yeah, and then with the same data and those same steps in Dorset, we just replaced 6 barriers to fish passage, and 3 of those were culverts. And that was, a lot of that was with US Forest Service and US Fish and Wildlife dollars. So we brought those in to replace culverts in Dorset, which the town was really supportive of and helped with any grant writing or permitting that they could help with.
Right, are we switching to,
Emily?
yeah,
I'm Emily Finnegan. I'm the district manager for Caledonia County Natural Resources Conservation District. You can go back to the base funding slide for just a moment. So just another word about the base funding slide. I think Hillary spoke a little bit about how the restrictions, the way that we get grant funding, and our financial structure doesn't always allow us to respond to landowners in the way that we would like. I think another thing to point out with the base versus grant funding is that because we don't have quite enough to cover the administrative functions that we need to run a business or an entity, sometimes we have situations where, like, there are, for example, I would love to establish like a health insurance program for, myself and my staff person, but that requires quite a bit of research on my part and quite a bit of like calling people and trying to understand something that is not my area of expertise. And because we don't have adequate base funding in order to address those things, we end up with a taxable stipend, which is what we have now for insurance. Same with something like family medical leave. I would love to be able to establish a family medical leave program for myself and my employees. Again, it takes a lot of research and extra time to do that. So there's several administrative functions that I'd like to spend more time on, but I'm not able to because of the way that our projects are and programs are put together. My job is still largely funded by projects, by like actually doing things that have deliverables, which I love to do. But it's hard to keep me and staff people working when those basic sort of like administrative functions I'm not able to address them in the way that I would like. So that's something about sort of something to point out in terms of base versus grant funding. It limits the time that I'm able to spend on that. And just a word on the increase in the base funding that we've had in the past couple of years has actually allowed me to spend more time on that, which has been really great. We were able to hire an extra staff person, and we were also finally able to change bookkeepers, which has really helped our district get a better handle on our finances and be able to plan more adequately for the future. We also were able to move a lot of our functions online, sort of reducing human errors. There's lots of exciting things that we're able to do with that, a little bit more of base funding that we've received in the past few years. So those are just my examples for that slide. And then the next one, this last piece, last slide, is just to point out that we are in state statute and we're a governmental subdivision in state statute. So that's all that is meant to point out. And I think that's it. I'm happy to take questions or provide any project examples that anyone's interested in, but that's all I've got for today.
well, since you brought up a couple of interesting examples of administrative tasks that you are, challenged to take on, I'm curious about the association's role or potential role, and maybe if the question that Jill would be better to answer, we can. And if you want to come up.
Yeah, I can say from my perspective, they provide quite a bit of support, but it's they have also a limited capacity to provide that support, and it's 14 districts asking for help with their health insurance. So it's a lot of work. They have one person in particular that works for both BACD and NRCC, who is someone who is, I don't know how I would run the district without her. She's very helpful, and answers lots of really good questions and does the research for us, which is great.
Person who splits their time between two different.
Technically, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
two different jobs.
Yep. She works for the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, running some of their grants and doing a lot of work for them, and then also responding to district needs, which are many. We have a lot of questions for her. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to add?
Other questions from the committee for Emily? If there's something, a project that you wanted to share with us, that you're prepared to share with us, but we've got some time, and if not, I don't want to put you on the spot, but.
Sure. The one that I had thought about is a very similar project to, not similar, but similar in its watershed scale to the one that Hillary presented. I've been working with the town of Stannard to replace some culverts in Stannard. And as Hillary mentioned, many of them were initially identified for fish passage, which basically means like there's essentially there's like a waterfall from the culvert into the stream and fish can't jump upstream. And this particular area in Stannard is a really big habitat, a nice habitat block for brook trout. So there's there's some funding available for replacements of those culverts for brook trout passage. Just so happens that most of those culverts are undersized anyways. So the one we replaced in September was actually like this really nice combination of like the town wanted to replace it, Vermont Agency of Transportation wanted to replace it, brook trout people wanted to replace it. So we got that replaced in September, and then there's a few others working on a watershed scale. And once they're all replaced, brook trout will have full access to Stannard Brook, which is really exciting. So, and then we're also working with the town road foreman on their road erosion inventory, which sort of sets them up to get funding from the Agency of Transportation to do more culvert replacements and do more work on their roads. Stannard was particularly hard hit in the storms in July and August. They had a lot of their roads like totally wash out. So, and I think also important to point out about Stannard and other towns that we work with in the Northeast Kingdom is that their capacity is quite limited to deal with situations like that. They've told me like they would never replace these culverts for natural resources reasons unless I was there, pushing them to apply for, to hold these grants and work with me to replace the culvert. So that's been really rewarding work and allowed me to get to know a small town pretty well.
Culverts like that have, for as long as they've been in place, they have never allowed for that kind of aquatic passage, or was there erosion over the years that made something that was once possible for fish no longer possible?
Yeah, most likely the latter in a lot of cases. Often when they're undersized, they become problems for fish. But depending on the culvert, what this particular situation was that led to it being not a barrier, or led to it being a barrier, we call it a barrier. Also, there's, now there's like way more attention on that. I think culverts in the past were likely installed without any thought really given to whether a fish could move through them. So.
Good job.
While we're on culverts, are you involved in dam removals at all, or?
Yeah, some districts have done more projects related to dam removals. There is one, so I sort of said, yeah, because we're just applying now for a design phase for it's not actually a dam, it's a weir in Danville. So the Sleepers River watershed is actually an old study watershed for USGS, and they have data collection on 4 of the 16 weirs. But the other 12 are just dams, basically, in the Sleepers River. So we picked one that seemed like it would need a standalone design. Some of them are really small. But we picked one that seemed like it would need a standalone design. So we're working on an application now to get that design funded. So that would be our first dam.
the difference between a dam and a weir?
I think that's a good question.
I just looked it up. Shall I read the
Yes, please do,
definition?
actually, that's better.
So what's the difference between a weir and a dam? A weir generally allows the water to flow over the crest, which is the top or sometimes underneath some sections. In comparison, dams mainly allow water flow to be regulated, controlled by gates and spillways.
That's what I was gonna say. So perfect. Yeah, and these weirs, they're really interesting because a lot of, they don't, the line of ownership has basically been lost. Like,
Mm.
there's no written,
Mm.
which is why they sort of languished as a project type for a little while. But I just stopped by the landowner yesterday. He invited me in and wanted to tell me all about the weir, and he's very supportive of continuing with the design. So that's another factor, right? Like, I did go to some landowners and they were like, no, 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 it's a swimming hole for our kids. Like, come back in 10 years. And I was like, all right, it's 14 of them, or 16, you know, I don't need to knock down every of the 16 doors.
I have one project that I.
You should go ahead.
You do, Representative Cole had another question, maybe.
My question is totally unrelated. So I don't know when the appropriate time is or if this is the appropriate space, but I'm curious, working with the land is often a very healing practice. It can be in some ways, so I'm wondering, have you ever done collaboration with the Department of Corrections through their work crew program, which now doesn't exist? But it's been something that's been in the back of my mind, like, I think, David, you and I have talked a little bit about this, how some kind of partnership would be really interesting, especially for some of the on the ground work that you guys do.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned their work crew doesn't exist anymore, because I've run into this with a project. I'm working on Peachum Pond, trying to do a stormwater redesign for their access area. It's very steep, and there's like, I don't know if any of you all have been there, but big ruts form every year. And part of the pushback that I've gotten throughout the design process is that the maintenance that the Department of Corrections used to provide, that labor crew, is much more limited now. And so Fish and Wildlife, he's been awesome to work with, but he's really like trying to make it as minimal operationally, like the need for maintenance as minimal as possible, which can sometimes compromise the design, although I wouldn't say that it's done that now, but it's been limiting in our design process because there's no labor crew. So no, we haven't really worked beyond that, but yeah.
Have you received testimony or would be able to provide testimony to others and maybe other committees about like the work program and how it's affected you? Maybe, or have us help out?
That feels pretty limited. Yeah, and I don't know if I can really speak to that.
Sure.
But yeah, it has been something that he's mentioned several times that, like,
Interesting.
the maintenance is not as, it's not as possible now that he doesn't have that crew to work.
Before we make the
Yeah.
switch again, just curious about in your, recognizing that you can speak for yourself here and your board, whether, we heard that every board has 5 members, each district has a 5-member board. Have you had, at the time you've been in the position, a full 5-member board? Is there difficulty getting people to serve in that role?
Yes. It is difficult to get people to serve in that role. I took over for a district manager who had been there for quite some time. And as anyone who's been on a board knows, sometimes that transition period is a good time for board members to sort of like move on. So I had basically full transition of the board. And I have 4 members now. And I would say it's partly that it's challenging to get people to serve on the board. It's also hard for me to make the time to recruit people to serve on the board. I think because we're not as visible sometimes, it's a little hard to explain to people why it's worthwhile to serve on our board. And I don't know that I'm that good at that. So I have I have 4 people on the board.
And is that part of the statute that there be a 5-member board for each district?
It does list 5.
Yeah.
Yes, it does say 5, but we have a quorum. So, yeah, it's a little tight. I wish that we had 5. So then 2 people could not come to the meetings and we'd still have a quorum. Yeah, and many districts also have advisory members to their boards. I think most districts have full boards. Some districts have full boards, some still have, it's hard to folks to serve, same as any nonprofit.
It's one of those administrative tasks that isn't funded either.
Yeah, board recruitment, yeah.
Board development, managing board. Yeah.
Right, that's why I would say it's sort of both, like it's hard to recruit people and it's hard for me to make the time to find people and make it worthwhile.
I will just mention, because I'm thinking of it, that I had an email today from a board member in our district who wanted to reach out, connect.
Great, yeah.
So yeah, it was positive.
Yeah,
So yeah.
yeah, that's great to hear.
Sarah, so did you want to come back up?
Sure. I thought that I could share a little bit, kind of going back to what you had mentioned in terms of our services to help landowners, agricultural producers access the variety of funding sources. And one of them certainly is the VHCD Water Quality Grant, which comes out annually and oftentimes dovetails well with state and federal programs that we're also helping a farm access to get a project completed. So we call that service our program navigation services. So as you all likely know, there's a lot of resources available to ag producers in the state of Vermont, and the Franklin County Conservation District now has this guide that we all use that has every resource that's available. I think it's like 120 pages at this point, which simply gives you a sense of how many resources there are. And oftentimes the conservation districts, again, serve as that hub of all of those existing resources to help folks access them. Because also probably, as you know, it sometimes can be hard and bureaucratic, and there can be barriers to accessing those because you don't have the right language, you don't have the right lingo, you don't know who the person is to call, you don't understand what a funding cap means or half of the acronyms that are in the application. And so we really help landowners, a lot of agricultural producers, navigate that system to identify what are your priority and goals, and then, match them up with the right resource. So this is a big, I think, body of work where the conservation districts sort of remain invisible because we are sort of the catalyst. And I think the catalysts oftentimes, don't get the recognition because the funders are the ones with the dollars on the table and the pretty project and everything. And so I sort of inside of that wanted to just mention a body of work that oftentimes ends up being like the entree to understanding the needs and the goals is through our nutrient management planning work. So a lot of conservation districts throughout the state offer nutrient management planning assistance, which requires what we call a land treatment plan, which means that staff person is walking every single acres of that ag land, taking soil samples, addressing natural resources concerns, looking at every stream, looking at the forest, looking at the pastures, looking at the farmstead, creating a comprehensive plan. Inside of that is, of course, the nutrient management plan, but then alternatively is a conservation plan that now the conservation district staff works with them to help navigate where is the best way for you to go. We have existing relationships with the Agency of Ag. The Agency of Ag has like this many grant programs. We know all the people who run those programs. NRCS, does it make sense for them to go to NRCS for X, Y, and Z? We understand X, Y, and Z. We know the person to call. We facilitate those staff going out onto those farms. Those projects grow legs. We monitor them over time, and we maintain those relationships with those producers. If something gets stuck in the NRCS world because of some paperwork or some staff turnover or some farm bill change, who knows, we can help them answer those questions. And so I do have a little handout that I can hand out to you guys that gives a specific example about a specific farm in Craftsbury that we worked with to write their nutrient management plan. And then we came up with a conservation plan. A big part of it was that there's a stream that runs right through the farm. In my conservation district, we have a bracketed water sampling program where we monitor above and below the farm to see what the impacts are of the farm. Of course, the farm gives us permission to do that. So this farm was open to doing that with us and addressing the REP issues that were identified in their nutrient management plan. It is a challenge when you have a farm, a stream running right through your farm. So we helped them access VHCB, the Agency of Ag, to put those funding sources together, and that's their water quality grant, to put a cover over their heifer manure storage, and get manure storage for their heifers, which was right next to the stream, not right next, in proximity to the stream that had identified, potential runoff issues. We also planted a 25-foot buffer there through the Conservation District program. That they also now do cover cropping on all of their lands. When there was a cornfield right in that same vicinity. And so we've monitored that farm over a period of time, looking at what the impacts were. And luckily that farm, the farm did a really good job. We didn't notice a huge amount of improvement from those particular projects. But it was a really nice, I think, for the farm to have that actual data that was theirs, and they could say, we did a really good job. So I can hand this around as just like a specific example of some of the work that we do, and highlights, that story, and then all of the different resources that were accessed. And I can leave this here too. And this is on the web. If you Google this, you'll find it.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
That's what I remember.
Yeah. There you go. Anyway, I just thought it might be nice to share that story if anybody has any questions.
John?
I just thought a good example might be, were you involved with the Loyal Valley Rail Trail? Because it seemed like, is that something that conservation districts would be part of that sort of team that made that happen?
I was not, only because it doesn't run through our area. Yeah.
That's run through Caledonia County, but no, it's more, most districts aren't involved much in recreation planning.
Right.
Or implementation. I think some districts work with, when a culvert goes under a vast trail, for example, they might work with vast to replace those culverts, but in terms of like high level recreation, no, most districts are not.
It's interesting, so we're co-house, we sublet to Snake Valley Trails.
Right.
And we're co-house, and my husband's actually on the board. But it's a really nice relationship because we're sort of adjacent, but we don't overlap. We don't compete for the same grants, but we really both love the outdoors and, wetlands and all the pieces that we can enjoy from our different perspectives and different type of work that we do. They're complementary, I would say.
Right.
Sarah, can I ask you about your board, level of, members, and whether you've got a full board?
Yes, so as of, we had somebody step down at our last board meeting, and so now I'm at 4 board members. I am actively looking for new board members right now, and I have had some good interest. So I think we'll be back to a full board pretty soon. Yeah.
Any other questions? And, so at some point there was somebody mentioned budget request earlier on. Have you had a chance to put something together? I don't know who I'm looking at here, but if there's something in writing, a letter, a request of, informal fashion, send it to
Yes, I
Caledonia?
think we have.
Okay, great.
So you should have that on your page. So
Okay.
it's a $3 million request.
Okay.
So it's an increase of 2.5 over the admin agreement that the agency included in the governor's budget. We appreciate very much your time. We're happy to answer additional questions or come back if questions come up, or I can field questions that come up with student discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thank you. All right, we are, so we have testimony at 3:15. We've got a few minutes. We'll take a break. We can